There is a strange moment that happens to a lot of Americans in their late 40s. It's not a crisis. Nothing breaks. No bill is overdue. It's just a quiet realization, usually in the middle of an ordinary day, that life is starting to feel narrower. You still earn good money. You still show up. But the future doesn't feel as open as it used to. You don't say it out loud, but you start doing a different kind of math in your head. Not about buying things, about whether time is running out. Here's the uncomfortable question. How can someone work for 25 years, do everything they were told was responsible, and still feel financially fragile? They saved, they avoided disaster, they made the adult choices, and yet, behind the pride and the paperwork, there's a tension. The fear that the life they built is heavier than the freedom they hoped for. Now here's the part no one prepares you for. This feeling doesn't come from laziness. It doesn't come from bad luck. It comes from sequence, from a series of perfectly normal decisions that slowly close doors while convincing you they're opening them. Nothing dramatic, just commitments that feel safe, payments that feel manageable. Plans that look reasonable on paper, until one day you realize that the future you imagined is being funded by the present. You can no longer change. And the most unsettling truth, the people who end up with options didn't work harder than you. They just arranged their financial lives in a different order. Tonight, you're going to see how that order quietly shapes everything. Not your lifestyle today, but your ability to choose your life tomorrow. For most Americans between 35 and 65, money stress doesn't show up as crisis. It shows up as background noise, a quiet pressure behind everyday decisions. You don't talk about it at dinner. You don't mention it at work, but it's there. The sense that time is moving faster than your finances. Charlie Munger used to say that the biggest mistakes in life aren't dramatic. They're subtle, comfortable, and socially approved. You don't go broke in one bold error. You drift into the wrong strategy, then defend it for decades. Housing sits right at the center of that trap. For most families, it is the single largest financial commitment they will ever make. Bigger than their retirement account, bigger than their business investments, bigger than anything else in their balance sheet. And yet, people spend more time choosing a refrigerator than they do understanding the long-term consequences of that decision. Why does this matter now? More than ever. Because the financial environment your parents lived in no longer exists. Interest rates are higher. Prices relative to income are stretched. Careers are less stable. Geographic mobility is no longer optional. It's required. The comfortable script that once worked in the mid-20th century doesn't survive contact with the modern economy. Meanwhile, Americans in midlife are facing a convergence of pressures. Children entering expensive years, aging parents needing support, health costs creeping upward, and the haunting realization that retirement is not a distant idea anymore. It has a date, and that date is closer than anyone likes to admit. Munger often warned that people confuse tradition with wisdom. Just because something has been repeated for generations doesn't make it true. It only makes it familiar. Housing is a perfect example. The narrative is so deeply embedded that questioning it feels almost disloyal, as if you're betraying the culture rather than re-examining a financial choice. And yet, when you strip away emotion, what remains is a simple problem. Most people make their largest lifetime investment decision without ever seeing the full trade-offs. They see the monthly payment. They don't see the invisible costs. They see pride of ownership. They don't see the silent loss of flexibility. They see a house. They don't see the alternative futures they just closed the door on. This is not about attacking anyone's lifestyle. It's about reclaiming agency, about understanding the difference between what feels responsible and what actually builds long-term security. Because the years when compounding matters most are slipping away quietly, and you only get one chance to sequence them correctly. Charlie Munger built his reputation on one deceptively simple idea. You don't get rich by being brilliant. You get rich by avoiding stupidity. Most people chase clever tricks. Munger spent his life building systems that kept him from making irreversible mistakes. When it comes to housing, the foundational principle is not whether homes go up in value. That's the wrong question. The real question is whether tying up massive amounts of capital in a non-productive asset during your peak compounding years is a smart use of scarce resources. The common misconception is that owning a home is automatically an investment. People treat the word as if it carries some magical property. If you invest in something, it must make you wealthier. But an investment is not defined by what you own. It's defined by what it does. Does it produce income? Does it compound? Does it grow faster than the alternatives you gave up? A primary residence fails that test for most people. Let's ground this in a clean, neutral example. Not a horror story, not a sales pitch, just math. Imagine a household considering whether to buy a modest home for $350. They put down $70,000 and finance the rest. The monthly payment, including interest, ends up around $1,900. Comparable rent for a similar place in the same area is about $1,400. That $500 difference doesn't feel life-changing. It's a dinner out, a car payment, a few groceries, and a tank of gas. People dismiss it because it doesn't hurt enough to demand attention. Now zoom out. That $70,000 down payment is no longer working for you. It's sitting inside drywall and kitchen cabinets. If instead it were invested and earned a reasonable long-term return, not a fantasy, just the kind of growth broad markets have delivered over long periods, that single decision alone could turn into several $100,000 over a career. The $500 per month gap tells the same story. $500 quietly invested every month is not dramatic in the first year. It barely registers, but compounding doesn't respond to drama. It responds to consistency. Munger once put it this way: the big money is not in the buying and the selling, but in the waiting. That line captures the entire issue. Housing absorbs the very dollars that need time the most. Another misconception people cling to is equity. They say, "At least I'm building something." What they really mean is that they're converting liquid capital into a locked container that can't be accessed without friction, fees, or upheaval. Equity feels real because you can point to it, but it doesn't behave like wealth. It doesn't generate cash flow. It doesn't rebalance itself. It just sits there, demanding upkeep. Meanwhile, the years between 35 and 55 are the financial equivalent of spring planting. Miss them, and no amount of work in your 60s can recreate the lost harvest. This is why Munger obsessed over opportunity cost. Every dollar has a second life you don't get to see. When you send money in one direction, you permanently close the door on every alternative future that dollar might have built. That doesn't make homeownership immoral or foolish. It makes it expensive in ways most people never calculate. And once you understand that, the conversation changes from, "Can I afford this house?" to a much more powerful question: what is this house quietly preventing me from becoming? Once you understand the principle, the next step is to see how it plays out in real life, not with theory, but with everyday American decisions, the kind that feel harmless month to month and irreversible decade to decade. Let's walk through a hypothetical family. Call them the Harrisons. They're both in their early 40s. Combined income is $135,000. They have 2 kids, modest savings, and a strong desire to do the responsible thing. They're choosing between buying a starter home in their metro area for $375 or renting a similar place for $1,500 a month. The purchase requires about $75,000 up front. Their mortgage payment comes to roughly $2 per month. Add insurance, property taxes, and a maintenance allowance, and the real monthly cost creeps toward $2. $400. Rent stays close to $1. $500. That $900 gap doesn't feel like a wealth strategy. It feels like an inconvenience. But let's speak it out loud in slow motion. $900 per month is $10. $800 per year. Over 10 years. That's $108,000 of cash flow that never got the chance to work for them. Now imagine they invested in a diversified portfolio, not chasing miracles, just participating in long-term growth. Layer on the down payment they didn't spend. $75,000 that now stays invested from day one. This is where the mistake usually happens. People look at year one and conclude nothing important is happening. Their balances don't change much, so they stop paying attention. But compounding doesn't reward excitement. It rewards staying put. Fast forward 15 years. The Harrisons who bought the house are proud. Their mortgage balance is lower. Their home value may have risen somewhat. They feel responsible. But their investment accounts are thin, because most of their surplus went into ownership costs. The Harrisons who rented look very different. Their investment account is now carrying the down payment, every monthly contribution, and the accumulated growth of all those early deposits. They didn't just save. They let time do the heavy lifting. Now, let's name the common mistakes that sabotage people at this stage. First, they underestimate friction. Transaction costs, taxes, repairs, and lifestyle creep slowly drain what they assumed would be equity building. Second, they ignore flexibility. Jobs change, health changes, parents age, kids move. A fixed asset in a fixed place becomes a constraint just when life demands adaptability. Third, they mistake discipline for destiny. Making payments every month feels virtuous, so they assume the outcome must also be virtuous. But consistency alone doesn't guarantee the right direction. Fourth, they wait for permission to invest. The house becomes the excuse. Once we're settled, once we refinance, once the kids are older, years pass. The best compounding years disappear. Munger spent his career reminding people that simple arithmetic, applied relentlessly, beats cleverness. The tragedy is not that people choose homes. It's that they choose them without understanding the cost of what they're giving up. Not in lifestyle, but in future optionality. Because money invested early doesn't just grow, it changes the shape of your life. Here's where Munger's thinking separates from most financial commentary. He didn't ask, "What can I afford?" He asked, "What mistakes permanently narrow my future?" That shift is everything. The non-obvious insight is that wealth is not primarily about accumulation. It is about optionality. The more liquid, flexible, and compounding your assets are, the more control you retain over your time, your work, and your relationships. Housing, for most working families, erodes optionality precisely when it should be expanding it. The contrarian idea is this: the earlier in life you lock yourself into fixed obligations, the harder it becomes to exploit rare opportunities. And rare opportunities, the job that pays double, the startup that needs seed capital, the relocation that transforms your career, don't announce themselves in advance. They appear suddenly. They demand freedom. Munger's own career is a masterclass in this. He didn't optimize for comfort in his early decades. He optimized for capital mobility. He partnered selectively, avoided leverage where it threatened flexibility, and favored structures that kept him nimble. His wealth didn't come from a single brilliant move. It came from decades of not cornering himself. He once observed that a great business is one that keeps getting better while requiring less of you over time. Translate that into personal finance, and the lesson is blunt. Your financial system should be reducing stress as you age, not increasing it. This is why so many people feel trapped in their 50s. Their expenses are rigid, their assets are illiquid, their careers are demanding more energy just as their bodies are offering less. It's not that they failed, it's that their structure quietly boxed them in. Another subtle point: people overvalue ownership and undervalue control. Ownership sounds powerful, but control is what actually improves life. Control of your schedule, control of your location, control of which problems you solve and which you walk away from. A paid-off house looks impressive on a net worth statement, but it doesn't send you a check every month. It doesn't let you downshift your career or take a sabbatical. It doesn't buy back your mornings. This is why Munger emphasized that the first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. Selling investments to fund large, non-productive purchases interrupts the very engine you're relying on to rescue your future self. The advanced mistake is not buying a home. It's doing so before your investment flywheel is self-sustaining, before your assets are producing income without you, before your margin of safety is wide enough to absorb surprises without stress. Once you've crossed that threshold, once your capital is working harder than you are, the equation changes. At that point, consumption becomes a choice, not a threat. But doing it too early reverses the math. It shifts the burden back onto your labor, just when labor is becoming more fragile. This is not about being extreme. It's about sequence. Build the machine first. Enjoy the comforts later. Reverse the order, and you'll spend your most powerful years paying for decisions your older self can no longer undo. Now let's move from philosophy to action. Not someday actions. Not when life slows down actions. Things you can start this week. First, calculate your true housing spread. Don't look only at the rent versus mortgage payment. List everything that disappears into ownership. Taxes, insurance, repairs, furniture upgrades, time spent maintaining. Then subtract what you would pay to rent a comparable place. The number that remains is not an inconvenience. It is potential capital. Second, redirect that capital automatically. If you're renting, set a standing investment transfer equal to that spread. Treat it as a non-negotiable bill. If you already own, isolate any surplus cash flow and start building a parallel investment engine so your entire financial future isn't trapped in one asset class. Third, protect your early dollars. Money invested in your 30s and 40s is more valuable than money invested later. Even if the amounts are smaller, your job is not to maximize contributions. It is to maximize time in the market. Fourth, design for flexibility. Avoid financial commitments that require perfect health, perfect employment, and perfect markets to survive. Build slack into your system so setbacks don't force liquidation at the worst possible moment. Now the objections. What if I'm already late? You're not late. You're just starting with clarity. The compounding curve is forgiving to consistency, not to regret. 10 disciplined years beats 30 years of drifting. What if I fail? You will. Everyone does. The difference is whether your structure allows failure without catastrophe. Small mistakes inside a flexible system teach you. Large mistakes inside rigid obligations trap you. What if I really want a house? Then decide consciously. Treat it as consumption, not a wealth strategy. Make sure your investments are already on autopilot before you add permanent expenses. This is the unglamorous work Munger respected most. Building habits that remove emotion from decision-making. No heroic discipline. Just boring systems that quietly compound your future. When you zoom out far enough, the entire debate stops being about houses. It becomes about dignity. Dignity in your 60s is waking up without financial panic. It is knowing that your bills don't dictate your identity. It is choosing how you spend your remaining healthy years instead of renting them out to the highest bidder. Charlie Munger often framed life as a long series of avoidable errors, not tragedies. Errors, small decisions, repeated often enough, that quietly shape the final chapter of your story. Housing is not evil, but misunderstanding its role is one of those slow, invisible errors that rewrites your ending. Wealth, in its truest form, is not something you display. It is something you experience. It is margin. It is silence. It is the absence of forced choices. A financial system that compounds on its own gives you that margin. A system built on obligation and rigidity takes it away. Munger once said that the best thing a human being can do is to help another human being know more. That's the spirit of this conversation. Not to judge your past, but to illuminate your future. If your money is working harder every year, life gets lighter every year. If your money is locked in place, life gets heavier. The sequence matters. Build the engine first. Enjoy the comforts later. That order is the difference between arriving at retirement with gratitude or with quiet resentment at a past self who didn't know what questions to ask. If this conversation challenged something you've always assumed, let that be a good sign. It means you're thinking independently. Exactly the habit Charlie Munger spent his life encouraging. If you'd like more discussions like this, practical, calm, and grounded in long-term thinking, consider subscribing, not because you need another channel in your feed, but because these ideas only work when they're revisited and reinforced over time. Your next step is simple. Watch the video linked on your screen about building your first six-figure investment portfolio. It connects directly to what we discussed today and gives you a clear framework for turning theory into action. And I'd really like to hear from you. In the comments, answer this honestly. What decision are you making right now that your future self will either thank you for or quietly regret? Your answer might be the moment everything starts to change.